Welcome to session 5 of a lecture on international political economy. Today we will discuss international trade with the unofficial subtitle Freedom for Whom. Today's session is the first session in which we leave the historic narrative and now go into certain aspects of current global political economy, or as the authors of the textbook name it, into dynamics of current international political economy. Today's session will be structured a little bit differently from the last couple of sessions. Today I will first try to gather the most compelling arguments for free trade, thereby also explaining what free trade actually is. After that, I will name a couple of arguments against free trade. Towards the end of the session, I will then give a short outlook on the relation between free trade and the current COVID-19 pandemic. So let's start. Let's gather arguments for free trade. For this, we first have to see what trade itself is before we can then see what free trade is, before we can then see why free trade might be good. So let's begin with a scenario. The first part of the scenario is that we suppose there is such a thing as property. Property is a social institution that establishes a relation between a natural or legal person on the one hand and an object on the other hand, and in this relation the person has the exclusive right to decide over and do with the objects as they please. And imagining that we have such an institution does not need much imagination because it's there in our everyday lives. However, I did not want to take this as self-evident because historically we cannot assume that it always has been there, and property by itself is not something that's given by nature, although some political philosophers assume that it's a natural thing. Like, for example, John Locke believed that there was such a thing as property in the state of nature. However, other political philosophers, think of Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, did not believe that this was the case, and neither is it historically clear that such a thing always existed. So, however, let's just assume there is such a thing, and without it we cannot have trade. Second part of the scenario is, suppose a certain thing that you really want or need is the property of someone else. And of course this is too bad that this is the case. However, in our everyday lives it always happens. Shopping basically is about such a thing, because we go shopping because we want or need stuff, and the stuff doesn't belong to us. It's the property of typically the stores where we buy it, so that's very common for us. But it's not only in shopping, it's also if you just go down the street and see that someone else has some piece of clothing or some technical equipment or whatever they have, and you might think, well, this is something I really want. Now the question is, what can we do about it? So how can we deal with this scenario? One way to deal with it is, of course, to wait until the person whose property that thing is does not pay attention, and then you just take it. And this, of course, is not trade, it's theft. Second thing is, you just overwhelm the other person and take that thing by force, and this, of course, neither is trade, this is robbery. Another way would be to not take that thing by force, but to threaten the person with stuff that you might do to them if they don't give you that thing, and if they then give you that thing, that's, of course, neither trade, that's extortion. A fourth way that you can think of, and I don't know what tells about me that this is the fourth thing that I come to think of, but it is that you just ask very nicely if the other person would be so nice to give you that thing, and if they then give you that thing, then it's a donation of theirs and it's begging on your part, so that's not trade either. The fifth way to deal with it is something where we get somewhere in the proximity of trade, but it's not yet trade. So you could, for example, say hi to this person, and then it turns out you know that person, and then you say, well, you're my very good friend, and you have that thing that I really want or need, and you don't need it that badly. Won't you just give it to me? And you know that we are friends, so the next time there's something that you want or need and I have it, then I will give it to you. So I'm not asking for a donation, it's rather that you're asking for a gift and promise to give some other gift at some point in return. This, of course, is silly when it's just some person that you meet while walking down the street. However, historically, in human history, these kinds of exchanges of gifts were socially very, very important, and at some points might even have been more important than trade in the narrow sense have been. And now finally, what is trade then? Trade is only taking place if the person has the thing and you have other stuff at your property, and then you offer some of your property to the person who owns the thing, and then you probably negotiate until you find a constellation with which both of you are comfortable, and then you exchange some of your property for some of their property, and then both have different property than they had before, and this is what trade is. So the difference between the exchange of gift and trade is that in the case of trade, it's really not about someone being gracious with the other person. It's rather that everyone looks out for their best interests, and then everyone exchanges property with the assumption that both pieces of property are somehow the same value. And I'm not going to go into what value is right here. Rather, I want to go deeper into what trade is, what trade means, and in this first section I will explain further why trade is good. So trade can be defined as the voluntary and mutual exchange of property to which both parties agree. So again, it has to be voluntary. There cannot be any dimension of extortion or threats or force involved. Then it's not trade, it's only trade if both sides agree to it voluntarily and then exchange property. And it does not necessarily have to happen at the same point in time. You can also say, well, the thing that you have, you can give it to me today, I will give you some money tomorrow. I don't have the money on me right now. This probably won't work in most shops, but it can work, and it's still trade. It's not part of the definition that it has to happen at the very same time. So again, trade is not theft or robbery or extortion or begging or donation or friendly exchange of gift, but it is something else. And trade usually happens, and you can probably mostly only think of it happening if both parties believe that they are better off what they have after the exchange as compared to what they have before the exchange. So let's say you're sitting on the table with a friend and you have a lot of fries on your plate and the other person has a lot of chocolate on their plate, and now you think, well, I like fries and I'm going to eat half of my fries, but in the end of the meal it's chocolate that will make me happy, so won't that person exchange some of their chocolate for some of my fries? And the other person also want fries before the chocolate, so after that both of them have half plate of fries and a little bit of chocolate, so both of them are happier with what they have afterwards than with what they had before, because now they have a full healthy meal. But in most cases it's not that fries are exchanged for chocolate. Typically in today's world it's mostly money that is being exchanged, at least on one side. So in your everyday life you very hardly ever will do this kind of barter where you go into a shop and offer them something to get something else. Rather, typically you buy or sell stuff for money, and in finance it's even that money for money that will be traded then. And typically trade takes place between two legal persons. So a legal person is either a natural person like me and you, or it's a business, or it's some organization, for example international organizations, but also other organizations like clubs or whatever you might think of as an organization, or also states are legal persons. So and typically it's that two legal persons who are by law able to have property, to own property, they exchange some of their property. However, and this becomes more and more important over time, there's also trade and even international trade that's taking place between subdivisions within organizations. And in IPE, we particularly are interested in trade that happens within transnational corporations, because this also crosses borders. So if we have, let's say, an international firm such as maybe Apple or so, they will then transfer some phones from one country to another country, and then the division in one country will also pay the other division of the company for it. However, it's not totally sure whether they will always really pay the real price, because what's good for the company might be quite different than what we think of in proper trade between two legal persons. So now, why is trade good? First of all, I already said that after trading, typically all sides are better off than they were before. Therefore, it increases the overall wealth. So oftentimes trade is something where one legal person or one side has a great amount of one kind of thing, but needs a lot of different things. So they will exchange that one thing all over the place and then get a lot of different things for it. And no one can live from having only phones or only apples or only whatever one thing there is. But if they have a lot of different things after the exchange, they will be wealthier than they were before, because now they have more that they can really use and consume. But this is a very static perspective where just people have stuff. It only gets interesting economically if we also think about people producing stuff. And there, trade is the thing that enables all sides to specialize their production on one special thing. So it's not that everybody has to produce their own bread, their own apples, their own telephones, their own cars, and so on and so on, which is very hard to do as an individual or as a household or as a village, but rather some people will specialize on producing cakes, and others will specialize on producing notebook computers, and then they can exchange, and this makes production much more efficient, which means that productivity will increase, and this also then means that overall wealth will increase. The next point sounds quite similar, but it aims at something a little bit different. So here it's not only that specialization per se increases productivity and efficiency, it's more particular that with trade, each side will be incentivized to produce that thing that they can produce more efficiently than other things. And we already discussed this 2 weeks ago when discussing comparative advantage. You remember this theorem of David Ricardo, and this even adds more to the increasing efficiency. And again, an increase in efficiency in production at the end means an increase in overall wealth. And finally, we can argue that trade, particularly if it's international trade, will support the spread of knowledge and ideas. So that once again helps us all to get richer materially as well as ideationally, which means relating to ideas. So the thought is, if one country is very good at producing one thing and they distribute it all over the place and trade, other people will know more stuff about the thing, and so knowledge will diffuse over the whole planet, so more people will know more stuff, and then they will also become better at producing stuff, but also they just know stuff which is better per se. So you see, trade is good. It makes everyone on each side wealthier. So next, what is free trade then? Free trade is a term that's typically only used when it comes to international trade, and it refers to a policy or an international regime in which states do not interfere when businesses and or individuals conduct trade across national borders. So sometimes it's a misunderstanding that free trade would be about governments or state engaging in trade, and this is not what free trade is about. It's not about governments doing anything, rather it's about governments not doing anything, mainly governments not interfering with trade. So the idea of proponents of free trade is that governments take a very much hands-off approach on the economy in general and on trade in particular. So they just let businesses do what businesses do, and if they just let businesses do what they do, then all this magic that I just described about trade will unfold and wealth will grow all over the world, basically. So what is it in particular that states are asked not to do in order to have free trade? It mainly means that they should refrain from any activities trying to limit trade, and mostly states these days engage in activities interfering with import, not so much with export. This might seem counterintuitive from a common sense perspective, because in general imports is about that stuff comes into your country, exports is about stuff going out of your country, and in general one would assume that it's better to have more stuff coming into your country than stuff coming out of your country. So for example, if you think of economic histories of the Roman Empire, in very short, there are oftentimes stories about the riches from all the provinces coming to the city of Rome, and the Romans enjoying these riches of their empire. So their stuff coming into the city from all over the world is a good thing, because being rich means being able to consume a lot of stuff. However, in today's economy, most states are rather worried about keeping stuff out and helping their own businesses to get even more stuff out. And the history of this kind of thinking, which doesn't make sense actually, began in mercantilism, which is a period in history that I already mentioned probably in the first or second session. So it's a time of absolute monarchy in Europe, so maybe the 17th and 18th century. And then the idea was, the more gold we have as a country, the more powerful we are. So if we import goods, then we pay for the goods in gold, and then we export goods. So that's not what we want, but we want to import gold, then we have the gold, then we have the wealth, then we have the power. So we try to export as much stuff as we can in order to get more gold. This does not make so much sense. However, in today's economy, something similar happens, because if your businesses export a lot of stuff, then these businesses can grow and they can pay more taxes and they can employ more people. So here, export might actually bring some wealth. However, then you also want to import some stuff, so it's hardly ever about stopping imports in general. It's rather about putting up some obstacles for free flow of imports. And how can governments do that? Mostly we talk about tariffs, which is a type of tax on goods that come into your country. So if a company from Germany produces a ton of steel, then there will be the usual taxes on production that we always have. And it's of course fair if, I don't know, a Chinese steel company also produces a ton of steel, and then this will be imported to Germany, and they would have to pay the same taxes on that. That would not be a tariff, that would just be normal taxing. Tariffs are if just by crossing the border you have to pay another percentage of maybe, I don't know, 20% of the value of the good as a tax to the government. Then this is a tariff of 20%. This of course then makes these foreign goods more expensive in your country, and this means that your domestic steel industry will be more competitive as compared to the foreign steel industry. And historically, the main reasons to conduct these kind of taxes was to gain revenue for the government, and sometimes it was really the people that were responsible for the road. Maybe they were collecting some part of the value of the goods in order to let the people pass. So it's sort of like a toll for using the road. But this was historically so. Today, collecting tariffs is more about protecting your own industry than it is about creating government revenues. However, it still generates government revenues, of course. And now you might think, well, that's good for the country that's importing and imposing tariffs then, because they gain revenue and the others have to pay it. However, that's not actually the case, because the ones who also have to pay it are the customers in the country, because now steel will cost more in this country. And now you can say, well, I don't ever buy a ton of steel, so why do I care? Which is a fair point. However, if you might buy a German car or any other German product made from steel, the increased steel price will of course then be part of that price of the consumer good that you buy. So you will, as a consumer, actually pay the taxes, and also you will have to pay for the less efficient industries in your country being maintained. So this is tariffs. And if you are for free trade, you want as low tariffs as possible, and at best you want no tariffs at all. However, tariffs are only one side of the barriers to trade. The others are what are called non-tariff barriers to trade, or NTBs sometimes also non-tariff measures, and then it's NTMs. And some of these are import quotas. So you say, as a country, I will only import 1,000 tons of steel per year from China, and after that you'll just shut your border to steel from China, or then you'll charge some insane amount of tariff on that. So you have a certain quota of what you will import, and this will have a similar effect to tariffs in the end. It will limit the imports and it will rise the prices at home, while being an obstacle for the industries abroad. Then there might also be some export restrictions, which is a little bit of a different story. I'll come back to that later when I talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. So export restrictions, of course, do not help your domestic industries, but they are there if there's certain products in your land that you don't want to get out because you want to keep them for yourselves, or you don't want others to have them, like for example war weapons. Then there's the nice term of voluntary export restraints, and this is something that's not really voluntary. So this is typically part of some negotiation. So for example, let's say the German government has some reservations about steel imports from China because they are bad for the German steel industry. So they will sit down with China on the negotiating table and will say, well, it would be very nice of you if you restricted your export of steel to our country to this and this amount, and in exchange we will give you something else, maybe some export restriction on some German product or whatever the Chinese governments may want in exchange. This of course has a very similar effect to import quotas, only that it's not part of a unilateral action, but rather of a multilateral deal. And these are more or less overt kind of import restrictions. And then we also have some kind of covered restrictions. For example, if you define certain product standards that all products have to meet in order to be sold in your country, which is of course totally fair, because if, I don't know, chairs are sold in your country, you want that all these chairs are able to support maybe 200 kilograms, because you don't want people to break their neck when sitting down on a chair, so that's totally fair. However, if these restrictions are artificially modeled to discriminate against products from another country, so you artificially define certain standards that products from your country will meet anyway and the others will not, then this is also an import restriction. Something similar goes for anti-dumping measures, which are measures against companies selling products below their production cost in order to push other companies out of the market. So if we have a very, very big international corporation, they can afford to make losses for a couple of years because they have so much money and so much volume in the background, so they can afford to make losses with one branch of their business over a number of years. So they just expand into a new market and just dump products there cheaper than they can produce them in order to destroy the industry in this country. And after that, when they have a de facto monopoly, then they will raise prices because then no one can challenge them. And this is of course a business practice that you don't want, so you can take measures against this. However, governments will claim that there's dumping happening when there's actually not dumping happening, and then they will veil their own import restrictions as anti-dumping measures. So in free trade, you want none of these things that are just described, because all of these things are bad for trade. What will free trade then do? It will create incentives for businesses in all countries to focus on producing what can be produced most efficiently in this country, and this is what the theorem of comparative advantage is about. And there's this very nice example in the textbook about this, where you say, well, we have a country such as New Zealand, where you have a lot of space, a lot of land, and it's in a mild climate, so it's very easy to just like have sheep there, and then you have a lot of sheep herders, and you create a lot of wool that you can then export. So that's what can be best done in New Zealand. However, you have rather few people in New Zealand, so it's very hard to have labor-intensive industries there. Labor-intensive industry are industries in which you need relatively little land, relatively little capital, but a lot of people working in these factories, for example. So this is not so good in New Zealand. However, sheep herding might be very good in New Zealand. Then you take Bangladesh on the other hand, where you have a lot of people but very little space and not so much capital also. So what do you get there? You have some industries where you need a lot of people doing a lot of work, but you don't need very heavy machinery and you don't need very much land. So this is, for example, true for the textile industry, which is why you then have mostly textile factories in Bangladesh creating shirts, or maybe also masks for that matter. And then you might have a third country, such as maybe Germany, where you have, by comparison, a lot of capital, where you have quite a few people, but not as densely populated as in Bangladesh, and maybe also with a higher education and a higher wage level. So then it's too expensive to have all of these people work in textile factories, because they will get more higher wages. So you have rather capital intensive industries in Germany, where the factories itself will cost a lot of money, and then you need an educated workforce. So all of these countries do their best. And in theory, you could herd sheep in Germany, you could manufacture textiles in Germany, you could manufacture cars in Germany, and maybe you could even do it better than in some of the other countries. However, if Germany focuses on producing cars, Bangladesh focuses on producing shirts, and New Zealand focuses on creating wool, then it's the best for all of them, and all of them can exchange, and so the overall wealth will grow once again. Therefore, in general, free trade will allow all these things to happen internationally that are already described about trade making everybody richer. So you might ask, if free trade is such a good thing and if everybody is winning from free trade, why don't we have free trade to begin with, and why could anyone be against free trade? Or ask another way, if we want to get to free trade, what kind of obstacles do we have to overcome here? The first obstacle is what you could name protectionist ideology, or this mercantilist fallacy of trade as a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a type of interaction in which everything that one player gains is something that the other player loses. So if a certain trade interaction helps the one person becoming more wealthier, it can only happen at the cost of the other person being less wealthy. And this is how the mercantilists thought about trade. And maybe today some people still follow this kind of ideology. So you have to overcome this ideology. And how do you overcome this ideology? By explaining that trade is not a zero-sum game, but a positive sum game. So trade is a game in which both sides can win at the same time. However, this is only an ideological barrier that you can overcome. There are also some stronger political barriers. One of them is what we can call lobbyism of special interest groups that are actually negatively affected by free trade within certain states. So far I have explained that on balance, in the end, free trade is the best for the populations in all countries because wealth will increase overall. However, there will of course be losers, at least in the short term. So for example, if we take up the example that I just had before with Bangladesh producing textiles, Germany producing machinery, and New Zealand producing wool, then we can think this is what happens after free trade. But before free trade, there was of course a textile industry in Germany and quite a few German textile firms. Those firms and companies still exist. It's only they don't produce many textiles in Germany anymore. So of course these firms and their employees, they were actually losers when this free trade emerged, because then they lost their production locations here, they lost their income here, the workers lost their jobs here. So in the short term, there were losers of free trade in Germany. On balance, they might all still win, and in the long run, they will all win. However, in the short run, they have a reason to be afraid of free trade. And even if free trade is better for the whole population and the overall wealth in the country, it can very well be that these small egoistic groups that are against free trade because they are individually negatively affected, that they care more about this issue than everybody else. Because for everybody else, maybe the price of a t-shirt will decline by 30% maybe because of free trade, which is good for everyone. But for this small minority, their income might decrease by 50%, which is something that is way more pressing of an issue for them. So they might start lobbying against this free trade deal between Germany and Bangladesh, and the rest will just not really care about this, not really know about this, because they only have the prospect of maybe paying 30% less for t-shirts, which you do, I know, a couple of times per year maybe. But these few, they have a good reason to be very active about this. So there is a certain chance that these very few will still win politically, because they can then exert pressure on their politicians, on their representatives, and then they will not let this trade happen. So it's bad for the overall wealth, but it's good for this group that it will not happen. So this kind of lobbying by certain business sectors or certain unions in sectors that are negatively affected by free trade, this is something that has to be overcome in order to have free trade. And what do we need there? We need institutions that prioritize the general interest over these particular interests, and which means we need some kind of democracy where the majority will then overrule the minorities. However, it's not sure how we can get there, but that's what we need. finally, there is a last obstacle which is not on the level of domestic politics, but rather on the international level. Because if we say that a free trade regime is overall the best for everybody's wealth and everybody's development, then we can still see, well, we have one country that lives in this free trade world with all the other countries having no tariffs and no non-tariffary barriers to trade. However, this one country, they will impose some tariffs on the others. And this, of course, means that for companies and businesses in this country, all markets in the world will be open. However, the businesses in the other countries will not be able to access the market of this country. This, of course, is a big advantage for the businesses in this one country, and maybe also for the people in the country as employees. Also, they might pay some for it as consumers. However, because the economy will develop quite fast in this economy, they will overall win. And this kind of model can be argued that this is how Germany, for example, developed in the 19th century, in which there was this free trade regime imposed by the British, but the Germans, to some extent, were free riders, as we call it in this system. And this can work for one country if all the others keep on doing free trade. However, if single countries start becoming these kinds of free riders, then the whole system might collapse, because then everybody wants to do it and they want to punish that one nation for free riding, and in the end you have a constellation in which everyone will impose tariffs once again. So this free riding might be attractive to a single actor, but overall it's a danger to the whole free trade system. So what can we do against it? We need an international regime fostering reciprocity, so fostering the idea that a tariff that will be imposed by one country can also be imposed by others, but if one country reduces their tariffs, then the other will also do so. And this is one part of what the free trade regime after World War II achieved, and I already explained this last week. This regime consists mainly of the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was instituted in 1947 and was the main institution of the international free trade regime for the following decades, until it was transferred into the World Trade Organization in 1995. I'm not going to go much deeper into the history of this because it's extensively discussed in the textbook. It was already discussed last week, and I don't want to repeat all this here again. Just want to first briefly remark what the word regime here means, because the word regime typically has a bad sound to most of us, because it's a word that's typically used for oppressive governments as opposed to democratic governments. However, that's not what a regime means right here. Regime right here only means that it is an international institution that will incentivize individual states to follow certain rules. So it's a set of rules that states have an incentive to follow, and this is exactly what free trade is about. And as I just explained to you, if there are no general reciprocal rules which states have an incentive to follow, it will be very hard to reach a free trade order, because there's always the danger of free riding with all the dynamics that it might cause. So what are the four principles of this international free trade regime of the GATT and the WTO? First, we have the principle of non-discrimination. There are two parts of non-discrimination that are important here. First is what we call national treatment. This means that all international businesses only have to comply the same rules as domestic businesses. So again, if you are a Chinese steel producer and you want to sell your steel in Germany, then you have to comply with the German rules, of course. However, you only have to comply with the German rules. There are no extra rules that you have to comply, so you have the same duties and the same rights as a German steel manufacturer would have, and this is what national treatment means. So this is about not discriminating foreign companies as compared to domestic companies. Then we also have the most favored nation treatment, which is about treating all other nations equally within that regime. And this basically means if you lower your tariffs on steel imports from, I don't know, India, then you're not allowed to charge higher tariffs for steel exports from China. So if you lower the barrier for one country, then all other countries automatically have the same right, theoretically at least, because there is this one exception to this rule, namely it's regional free trade agreements. So Germany and all the other countries in the European Union, plus some more countries, of course, have a customs union, so they don't charge any tariffs among one another, and this does not mean that they cannot charge any tariffs from anywhere, because this is the exception to the rule that if you are a regional free trade agreement or a regional customs union, then you are allowed to make these kind of exceptions for all the other members in your regional club. And this is kind of contested because there's the fear that this kind of regionalization will actually undermine global free trade. However, the evidence rather says it probably does not. However, the principle of non-discrimination stands. You have to not discriminate against foreign companies, and you have to not discriminate countries against one another. The next principle is reciprocity, which means, at least as an idea, that if one country lowers its tariffs, it will be granted equal concessions from other countries, and this is supposed to lead to more positive dynamics from the perspective of free trade. So instead of these trade war dynamics where one country starts raising their tariffs and then all the others will do this, and this will become an arms race under which everyone will suffer, rather than that we'll hope to get this arms race the other way around, where one country lowers its tariff and then all others almost automatically will also lower some tariffs, and so we get to the bottom rather soon, hopefully. Then we have the principle of transparency, which means that you are only allowed to use overt tariffs and overt restrictions and no hidden restrictions. And this might seem confusing at first because the GATT is all about reducing tariffs, but then again it has this principle that tariffs are the only thing that's allowed. However, this has its logic because tariffs are quite transparent and you know what you have, you know what you get, and also economically, from the perspective of economics as a discipline, it's quite easy to calculate what the cost of a certain tariff is. If you, however, have these kinds of non-tariff barriers, such as import quotas or such as subsidies to your own industries or other kind of non-tariff barriers, then it's much harder to calculate what the cost is, and then it's also difficult to calculate what the others could do to reciprocate, and so this becomes difficult. So you only want tariffs and you want full transparency, and you don't want all these hidden kinds of barriers there. Finally, you want multilateralism. You want that everyone commits to keeping this regime as broad as possible and take in as many states as possible with the cooperation in a rule-based system. So you don't want this kind of backroom diplomacy where always 2 or 3 countries try to get the best for them and keeping others out. You want a multilateral agreement where everyone will benefit and everyone knows what is what. So what will this regime with these principles help? It will first help governments to overcome pressures from special interest groups domestically. I just described the problem. And how will this regime help? It's that the government can always say, well, we're part of this free trade world and we're benefiting from it, so these are rules that we have to comply with. So I'm sorry, German textile industry, we cannot protect you from free trade. That's just the law here. So this will help them to overcome this domestic pressure against free trade. Also, it will give an incentive against free riding. So as I explained before, in a world without these kind of rules and without this regime, there is a quite high probability that free riding will take place. But now with this regime, it gets more difficult to have this free riding. And if you look at what this regime did, you can say it was rather successful. So this graph here shows the tariff burden within the GATT over the course of the 45 years or 40, 50 years that it was in place before the WTO. And you see that the overall tariff burden decreased from 40% to below 4%. So this is quite a success story. And this is also mirrored in statistics on growth in trade and production. What we see here are, of course, two columns for each of these periods, where you see how much the trade and how much the production did grow in this time. And I'm not going to go into the details here. What you, however, see is that in each of these periods, trade grew faster than production did grow. This, of course, means that the share of all the things that were produced that was traded was growing. So if before only a tiny fraction of all the things that were produced were traded internationally, now an ever bigger fraction is traded internationally. And we also see a certain shift in who's important in this trade. On the first diagram there, we mainly see that China is becoming more and more important. Before, we had mainly the triad of the European Union, the United States, and Japan. And while the share of the European Union roughly stayed the same over the course of these 15 years that are in question here, or 16 years from 1995 to 2011, the share of the United States and the share of Japan shrank, while the share of China more than tripled or even quadrupled over this time. So China is becoming ever more important as an actor in international trade. And you also might remember that China became a WTO member in 2001, and so you see that after they became a member, their trade increased even faster than it did before. On the right-hand diagram, you see something different. So these are only relative developments here, and what you see here is how the imports in developed country as opposed to the developing country and emerging markets changed. And there you see that while the imports of the developed countries only grew by maybe 12-13%, the imports of the emerging and developing country increased by probably 31 or 32%. So it is the case that trade is more and more shifting towards countries outside the early industrializers. This, of course, could mean that what I showed you a week ago, so this diagram about the triad and mostly having a north-north trade, might change over time, and that the participation of developing countries in trade might increase. However, it's very well possible that most of this is carried by China. So now the last slide of my flaming pro-free trade plea that I make right here. Some of the arguments that you often hear about free trade, debunked. So first, many argue that states have to protect their infant industries. And the counter argument of free traders is that we don't actually see this. We see that states that try to isolate themselves from trade, that they fare much worse than those states that actually engage in trade. And in order to develop, countries need to engage in free trade. And the numbers are quite clear here, that all developing countries that try to develop in isolation basically failed. Next, we have the claim that free trade only helps the richer countries. And here we can first say the same thing again. No, isolation doesn't help developing countries at all. And also we can argue that if we just do the math there, there's one thing that will help the least developed countries more than any kind of aid or whatever you could give. It's free trade in agriculture. So if the poorest countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America have the possibility to get full access to the markets in Europe, in North America, in Asia with their agricultural product, then it will help the economies more than any other program could help them. And the math is quite clear with that. Next argument is, well, there are people losing their jobs. So there are textile workers in Germany who lost their jobs when the free trade for textiles was allowed and all the textile production moved to Asia or other countries. There you must of course concede that there are jobs that are being lost. However, these jobs were in sectors of the economy where the efficiency was not so high beforehand, and this is also outweighed by two other factors. So first, there are also new jobs created thanks to free trade. So in other industries in Germany, the labor market will expand, so there will be new jobs, and also that consumer prices will decline. So there are effects that will overall, when you just like look in the long term and when you do the overall calculation, the wealth in Germany will increase despite of some people losing their jobs, which is a very short-term perspective. Finally, some people claim that free trade makes the government losing control, and there as a free trader you simply ask, do you really want to be controlled by a government? No, what you want is freedom and wealth, so free trade is the best you can give.